Hello and welcome. We apologize for those technical delays. Thank you for bearing with us. My name is Sarah Zenaida Gould, and I am the Interim Executive Director of the Mexican American Civil Rights Institute. I'm pleased to introduce tonight's panelists for a discussion about Mexican Americans and the right to vote. Tonight, we are joined by Al Kaufman, who is a professor of law at St. Mary's University, presently teaching constitutional law, federal and state procedure and education, and voting rights law. Before joining the faculty, he was a civil rights lawyer for 25 years, specializing in representing the Latinx population at MALDEF, the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, in private practice, and as a researcher at civil rights projects. He specialized in education law in Texas. Next, we have Margaret Montoya, Professor Emerita of Law at the University of New Mexico, School of Law, and also visiting professor in the Department of Family and Community Medicine at the University of New Mexico Health Sciences Center. She was among the first groups of students of color to attend Harvard Law School during the 1970s, and then served as a member of the University of New Mexico Law School faculty for about 30 years. She worked to create programs and partnerships to open doors for students and faculty of color, especially Mexican Americans, in law and in medicine. In 2002, she began combining her legal work in critical race theory with issues of health equity and served for several years as the senior advisor to the chancellor of the University of New Mexico Health Science Center. She and her colleagues have developed an anti-racism training program called Racial Literacy, which teaches the race-based and intersectional skills and knowledge that address the root causes of injustice and illness. And finally, we have Angelica Rasa, who is the Texas director for Mi Familia Vota. She was raised in Arkansas and moved to Houston to attend Rice University. She joined Mi Familia Vota in June of 2017 to lead their youth leadership program in Houston, which involved creating opportunities for Houstonians to participate in civic action, understand community issues, and create relationships with their elected officials. Angelica has been passionate about understanding how community empowerment leads to positive, sustainable policy changes in social issues. In her current position, her work focuses on local elections, the census, of course, the 2020 election, and more. So now, before we begin, I'm obliged to share that any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in tonight's program do not necessarily represent those of the Mexican American Civil Rights Institute or our funders. Okay, I want to first invite Al to share a little bit about his work and also tell us more about the 1975 expansion of the Voting Rights Act. Al.
I sure will. First, I want to thank MACRI for inviting me, and it's been fun to work with Sarah, Angelica, and Margaret. Good group here, and I enjoy it. Remember, October 5th is the deadline in Texas to register to vote, and I think it's also the deadline to count yourself for the census, although that might be extended. So that's the most important thing I'll probably say, but let me go back to a little background here. The Voting Rights Act is one of the major points I wanted to talk about. So I'm going to go ahead and talk about that now. In 1975, the Voting Rights Act, which had been in existence for 10 years, was applied to Texas. And the trigger was that Texas did not have bilingual ballots, had a large percentage of speakers of other languages, but didn't have bilingual ballots. And that's why we got covered by it. It turned out to be an extremely important law for the state and just revolutionized voting rights in Texas. What it does is it changes the burden. In a regular lawsuit, if a plaintiff sues the state or a county, they have to prove all the elements and prove there's a violation. And then if the county or the state changes, they have to go back and sue them again. The Voting Rights Act changes that and allows the community people to complain about any changes. And those changes are not law until the county or the city or the state can convince the Justice Department or a 3-judge court that they're not discriminating. So it's very important. And groups like MALDEF and Southwest Voter and LULAC, GI Forum use the Voting Rights Act very effectively to leverage change and to make sure that states and cities and counties were not discriminating. I was going to go back even a little bit farther. Back in the 60s and 70s, of course, the ballots were all in English. People who were monolingual, who were Spanish speakers or even predominant Spanish speakers, didn't have access to materials or voting or the ballot, and that excluded many, many people. You had the poll tax, which made it expensive to vote. Texas had the most restrictive voter registration and candidate registration policies in the country. The U.S. Supreme Court found that in the 1960s. There were just outright voter intimidation in many places. We at MALDEF represented people throughout South Texas who would go to the county tax assessor collector to vote, and they basically would hassle them and not allow them to register. So that was fairly common. So then it brought it up to the Voting Rights Act, which was very important. But even before the Voting Rights Act, there was a very important legal victory, which is called White versus Register. It was a U.S. Supreme Court case. It came out of Texas, out of San Antonio and Dallas. And in San Antonio, used to elect all of your state representatives from the entire county. So we have 10 state representatives. They'd be elected for the whole county. In Houston, there were 20 or 25 state representatives, whole county. Every county elected them from the whole county. But what that did was it made sure that a small group could control the elections because they would control a slate. In Texas, there was a group called, in San Antonio, there was a group called the Good Government League. And they controlled the slates of candidates for state representative. They controlled the slates of candidates for city council, and they ran their own government. One of my first cases was against single-member districts, against multi-member districts in San Antonio, and I got to discover information at the Good Government League, and they ran a whole government. So they would select their slate of candidates, they would run them, they had enough power. They were related to what Maria Antonieta Berezabal called, the 12 white men that ran the city, and they would control everything, including the elections, and then, of course, the government itself. So White v. Register said you can't do that anymore for state representative districts. So you had to break up San Antonio into 10 districts. So we went from just 2 or 3 Mexican-American representatives to 5 or 6. City council went from 2 Mexican-Americans to 5 or 6. So wherever single-member districts went in, you increase your number of minority successful candidates, but you also increase the access to the process. Very, very important. And of course, remember also, if all of your state representatives or city councilmen live in one area of the city, that's the area that they represent. That's the area they know. And even if you could get some Mexican-American or African-American members, they still would tend to represent their geographic area. So single-member districts were very important. Then in 1982, we got a new law. Section 2 was amended. That's the major voting rights law, and made it much easier for plaintiffs to win these cases. They're not easy, but it made it easier. So even if there wasn't a change, if there's a change of election, you have the leverage of the Voting Rights Act. But Section 2 said you could sue anyway. And I know Texas has been the scene of hundreds and hundreds of lawsuits. And the advocacy groups here for Mexican Americans, the Mexican American Legal Defense Fund, Southwest Voter, Texas Rural Legal Aid, other groups filed large numbers of lawsuits and basically forced almost anyone where you had a successful lawsuit, they would find it and they would bring it. So throughout the state, rural areas, urban areas, small cities, big cities, school districts, water districts, they were broken up into single-member districts, so you had a chance for some minority involvement. There was also litigation, talk about litigation, I guess I know the most about. Every time there was a statewide redistricting, there was litigation over state representative districts, congressional districts, even state board of education districts, Senate districts. And there was always some sort of dilution, and it took lawsuits and the Voting Rights Act to make this change. Now, things are going sort of the other direction now. In 2013, we lost the Voting Rights Act. The Supreme Court basically ruled it unconstitutional. 5-4, by the way. I have to teach that case. It's a painful one to teach. So they threw out the Voting Rights Act. So this leverage is gone now. And literally the day after the Voting Rights Act was thrown out, Texas and many other states put into effect, again, their voter ID provisions, restrictive voter registration procedures, restrictive. People like Angelica want to go out and register people, teach them how to do that. Much more complex, much more dangerous than it's ever been before. And all those laws just were pushed through once the Voting Rights Act was gone. So now after the census comes out, by the way, you know about the census problems. There's still a great undercount. We're very concerned about that. We're going to redistrict again in 2021 next year, and it's going to be amazing because for the first time in four decades, we won't have the Voting Rights Act. So there'll be really no leverage on the part of minority advocates. So it's a real loss, and it's a great concern for me. And in addition, one more thing to worry about. I'm sure everybody has a lot to worry about. There's also a movement among the very conservative parts of our state and other states to start redistricting, not based on total population, but on citizen population. So that's what a lot of the fight about the census, the citizenship question on the census was about. It was an effort by those folks to have more information so they could redistrict based on citizenship. So I am almost sure that some people in Texas and other states will come up with a recommendation there be redistricting based only on citizen population, not total population, which will really dilute the minority vote. So those are a lot of challenges, a lot of successes, and that's what I want to cover. I'm looking forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thank you so much, Al. I want to hand it over to Margaret Montoya for, I would love for you to share a little bit more about your journey, your personal story, and how other civil rights issues are also connected to the Mexican American right to vote.
Thank you, Sara. Thank you, Sarah, and MACRI for inviting me to be part of this program. I've gotten to know Al and Angelica. I'm so impressed with the work that both of you have done and are doing for our community. I'm just honored to be here with you. So let me begin by telling you a little bit about who I am. I'm a Nuevo Mexicana. My family has been in New Mexico for generations. So my concientización began probably when we were watching the marches and voter drives that were organized by Dr. Martin Luther King in the 1950s and 60s. And then my dad was active in Albuquerque in the Chicano movement. When I was at San Diego State, students like me helped establish the Chicano Studies program. When I went to law school, I have to say I learned a little bit about law, but I learned a lot about power. And I learned about what Al has just described, that the law is both an instrument for justice and injustice. And if we look at the legal history of the United States, it's a story about what President Obama has often talked about, making a more perfect union. And of course, those words define the purpose of the US Constitution. But making the 50 states with Washington, DC and the territories into a democracy where every citizen has a voice and a vote, where every citizen, regardless of race, color, background, that has been a very difficult project. When the nation was first created, only those who were white and male and owned property had the right, had rights, including the right to vote. So it took imagination and then the work of making the country into a multiracial, multicultural, multilingual nation. But that's only been the goal of the nation for about the last 70 years, since the Supreme Court declared legal segregation as unconstitutional. We Mexican Americans are seen as different for many reasons. We may be physically different because of the color of our skin, our hair, our eyes, maybe because of our body shape. Some of us speak Spanish, sometimes with an accent. Sometimes our English is with an accent. Many of our families emigrated here from Mexico. We've been stereotyped in movies and in books and by teachers and policymakers as lazy, as dirty, and as not having the intelligence to govern ourselves. Our food, our music, our dance, our religious practices are different than most white people's. So in the past, we were not seen as leaders or as role models. Our children were pushed aside and left behind by schools and other institutions. We were, and we still are, seen as different and not as good. To keep our culture, to be different and to belong, those two at the same time, that is what Mexican Americans have fought for. El derecho de ser mexicanas con orgullo y a la misma vez poder participar en la democracia, especialmente tener el derecho de votar sin barreras. Por eso luchamos y por eso estamos aquí. So let me talk a little bit about some older cases involving education and equal protection. And then I want to talk about some of the issues that are on the ballot in this year's election. Voting works with other rights, especially education. And Mexican Americans played an important role in Brown versus the board. That's the decision that ended legal education in public schools and later in other parts of the society. It is considered by many legal scholars to be the most important civil rights case ever decided by the Supreme Court. But there's a California case, Mendez versus Westminster, that also ended public school education. But it was decided in 1946, 8 years before the Brown case. The Mendez family helped set the stage for the famous Brown case. And it was Mexican American students, this Mexican American family and Mexican American attorneys who were at the heart of that case. But most people don't know this. At the same time that the Brown case was decided, the court decided Texas versus Hernandez, which greatly changed the application of the 14th Amendment and specifically the Equal Protection Clause. That had formerly applied only to former slaves and Black people. It was the Hernandez case that extended equal protection to Mexican Americans and other nationality groups. See, when judges decide cases, especially on appeal, they pick through the facts in order to tell a narrative, a story that reflects their worldview. And this is part of the Hernandez story that explains what the Supreme Court heard about experiences of Mexican Americans in Edna, Texas in 1954. At least one restaurant in town prominently displayed a sign that said, "No Mexicans served." And on the courthouse grounds where the hearings were going on, there were 2 men's bath toilets. One wasn't marked and the other one was marked colored men and hombres aquí. The court heard a story about Mexicans being in segregated schools and using separate public toilets, about being denied service in restaurants because we were seen as different. Civil rights cases use the law to try to ensure that people are treated the same regardless of race, ethnicity, gender. This has been a slow process for our community, but voting expands equality. Texas and San Antonio have played important roles in some of the civil rights cases. For example, San Antonio Independent School District versus Rodriguez. This was a simply terrible decision. The Supreme Court concluded that funding public schools using property taxes, even though it creates huge inequalities, was constitutional because education is not a fundamental right under the US Constitution. The struggles to vote are the struggles for voice, for the right to be heard by the government that will make decisions that affect every part of our lives: schools, jobs, housing, healthcare, immigration, air, water. All of these are affected by how we vote. This election is the most important election of our lifetime. The Trump campaign began with insults against Mexicans, calling our immigrant men rapists and saying that Mexico doesn't send its best people. Mexicanos and other Latinos have been brutalized by ICE, by the immigration courts and the immigration system. DACA students, after going to school or signing up for the military or getting other jobs, have been abandoned to worry month after month whether they and their families are going to be deported. Then we have the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, with its protections for people with pre-existing conditions. And The pandemic will be a pre-existing condition. It is hanging by a thread because Republicans are intent on getting rid of it, even during a pandemic. Mexican Americans in Texas, especially in the Rio Grande Valley, have been devastated. Some of the highest infection, hospitalization, and death rates in Texas. Why? Why? Because Mexican American workers do some of the hardest work in the society, in the fields, in meatpacking, in the back of restaurants. Our gente clean emergency rooms in hospitals. They dispose of hospital waste. Mexican American families live in neglected housing. They lack transportation, but live far from jobs. Many families are in mixed status families, documented and undocumented. They lack health insurance, and so they can't get health care. Mexican American families are treated badly by doctors and teachers and police. Over and over, we've seen that our government works for the richest people, and many, including Trump, don't even pay taxes. But government has not worked for working people who play by the rules and often pay taxes, whether undocumented or not. When the rich get richer, the society gets weaker. This election is like no other. It's not so much that it's an election between Democrats and Republicans. It's an election between an out of control president that we saw last night and our democracy. Think about Julian Castro. He was the first Mexican American to run for president. He made a significant impact by changing the terms of the debate with his progressive ideas on immigration, on policing, on race. Gracias, Julian. One way to think about democracy is that it is a system that is designed in which there is someone that loses in the election. The party loses and then gives up power. Since 1800, the losing party has left the White House. And what is Trump saying? That he can lose only if the election is rigged, and he's going to fight the outcome. We must defeat him by a huge vote, especially in places like Texas. So this is what I'm asking you. Make a plan, not just for you, but for your family. Ask and to make a plan together. Is everyone registered? You still have a few days. Do you know how to vote? Do you know where to vote? Do you know the voting location? Make a family plan. Encourage your abuelitos, your tíos, your tías, your primos, your amigos. Les ruego, por favor, hagan un plan para votar, un plan familiar, un plan para asegurar que todos lleguen a votar. Por favor, porque el futuro de nuestra comunidad, por los niños, nuestros nietos, por el bienestar de nuestra comunidad. Por favor, les ruego. Thank you. Thank you very much. And I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Margaret. I want to turn it over to Angelica. Angelica, we'd love to know a little bit more about you, what led you to your work with Mi Familia Vota, and what's happening right now in terms of challenges and barriers that face Mexican American voters right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm just so honored to be here tonight as a proud Latina, as a civic nerd. I think I'm, really among my superheroes, and so glad that Sarah, you brought us together for such an important discussion to talk about the history of the present, right? And make sure that history doesn't repeat itself. My name is Angelica Rasa. I'm the Texas State Director for Mi Familia Vota. We're a national civic engagement organization, and our mission is to increase political power and representation for the Latinx community and our ally communities. And why that's so important to me, I just want to share a little bit more about my background. My family's originally from Mexico. I was born in the United States, but I grew up in a mixed status household where conversations around immigration, deportation, ICE, La Migra, right? Were conversations we were having at the dinner table, but conversations I couldn't take outside my household because we were too scared, right, to talk about that beyond, the comforts of our home and the security of our home. And so I grew up with this belief that education is just so key, right? I was really thankful for my parents, even though they have a first grade education, a third grade education, that, the sky was the limit for all 7 of their children to, graduate from high school, which is a huge victory for our community that should not go unrecognized, but also to go off to college and be professionals. And so I thought, all I have to do is go to college and graduate from college, and that is what success means. So I was really privileged to attend Rice University. And my first time that I voted was on Rice campus. It was in the 2012 presidential election. I almost didn't vote. I had a really busy day. I was really excited to vote. I didn't know early voting existed. I've always been really passionate about community service and knew that as soon as I had the opportunity to vote that I would do it. But I was not very informed, had no resources, no information, got really busy, had classes, had a job, barely made it back to campus. Almost didn't vote because I said, the polls are probably closed, so why should I try? But I wandered in regardless at around 6:58 p.m. I think 2 more people came in behind me. I was really nervous because they were asking me for my ID. I was by luck, I had my ID on me, right? And I went and I voted and I looked at the ballot and I recognized a total of maybe 3 or 4 names on that entire ballot. And I was really overwhelmed and I felt really disappointed that I didn't know what to expect. But regardless, I voted. A very uninformed voter. Again, someone that's very passionate, that has been very passionate about issues impacting the Latino community, issues that impact my community. And I saw that ballot and I did not know how those issues, how candidates and those positions impacted so many things that I was so passionate about. And it wasn't until years later that I ran into Mi Familia Vota. And just like Margaret said, power. The concept of power in our community really became clear to me. And what became more clear to me, that all these issues that I was really passionate about, health disparities, immigration, environmental justice, why do we have lower college graduation rates? Why are we attending schools that are not properly funded? We're showing up in our communities as a result of lack of political power and representation. So when I joined Mi Familia Vota, I joined as a youth organizer. And I was, again, I always tell people I felt like I had a lot more in common with students that were part of Houston ISD and were going to severely underfunded schools than some of my colleagues at Rice University, right? Because of similar upbringings and similar passions and similar cultural beliefs and similar conversations that we had with our families and parents that were resulting in us being very largely uninformed, passionate, energetic, wanting to take the world, but not knowing how we build power as a community. And so just thrilled to be part of an organization that recognizes we have to invest in young leaders. We have to invest in making sure our community has information, resources, and that they're empowered to, one, vote, but then also stand up for the issues that are impacting them and advocate on behalf of themselves, build those relationships with elected officials. So fast forward 3 years later, we have a big vision for the state of Texas. And sometimes one of the things that stops us is voting rights and lack of access to democracy for our people. And it's so important that we have a fundamental understanding and consensus that everyone that wants to vote should be able to vote and should not be met with roadblocks. So when I was talking about the poll tax and not being able to have bilingual ballots, people say that's a thing of the past. We've come so far. But the thing is, Texas and some other states have been really strategic in hiding voter suppression and just putting it in our election code. And it shows up in really discombobulated wording, and we just kind of glide over it. For example, you have to register to vote 30 days before an election. And if you miss the deadline, you're just not eligible for this election. You want to register to vote, or if you want to register other people to vote, you have to take a training. But if you don't take that training, you can't register other people to vote. So when Margaret is saying, help your families register to vote, there's people out there that want to and may not realize that they don't have all the tools in order to do so. It shows up by not having online voter registration, and people right at this minute recognizing that it's 5 days before the deadline and scrambling to figure out where they're going to get a physical form. I spent about 20 minutes last week talking to a lady that lived out near the Dallas area, or I guess more central Texas, but she said, I really want to register. And I want to make sure that, I can see the form that I'm using to register to vote. So we were trying to identify where is the nearest location near you where you can go and pick up a form. It was going to require for her to take off work early and make sure she was at the office where she could pick up a form by 4:30. And these are the challenges that people are facing. So when we are telling vote for, we also have to recognize that we're also responsible for building and advocating and demanding a system that allows people to do that, to register to vote, to be able to show up at the polls. So voter suppression looks like requiring that on election day, you have to go to your assigned polling location. We've also seen that people get turned away at the polls because they're showing up at the wrong location. It means that when they're going to polling locations, they're met with people that speak their language, whether it's Spanish, whether it's Vietnamese, whether it's Mandarin. Texas is a very diverse state. Mexican Americans and Latinos are not alone in the struggle for access to democracy. So recognizing that we have to ensure every Texan, really every US citizen can register to vote. It also looks like welcoming the new faces to democracy. First-time voters, people that just turned 18 are so ready to cast a ballot, like myself, and then realize they actually didn't know what they were supposed to do. Nobody told them. Nobody went out of their way to make sure they had that information. Newly naturalized citizens, a big thing we're facing right now is because of COVID, we have lots of folks that were not able to get naturalized in time, right? And so they were not eligible to register to vote. So it's so important that when we're talking about these challenges, we're not just saying, hey, go register to vote, but we're really understanding, is it inconvenient or is it a barrier? Because it might be inconvenient to some people, but to other people, it's a barrier. And just because it's an annoyance to you, doesn't mean that for someone out there, it's the very real reason that they may not go out and vote, or that they want to vote and they get turned away. Another thing that we commonly see is that, people show up on the very last minute. People show up at 6:58, just like I did, and then they want to vote, and then they're complaining about long lines. Well, let's make sure we have systems that welcomes hundreds of people flocking to the polls at the very last minute because they just got off work, or they just dropped off, they got off work, they had to go run some errands. So as opposed to complaining or recognizing, but voting has already been so easy. Look at all the victories we've had in the past. Look how far we've come. We don't turn a blind eye to how currently in 2020, folks are really struggling to get access to the ballot. And Margaret, I would really, take your call to action a step forward. When we're telling people, make a plan to vote, vote with democracy in mind. There are elected officials that decide whether we are going to expand access to democracy. And we hardly ever bring that up as an issue. We hardly ever ask them, do you support online voter registration? Do you support fair redistricting? What are your thoughts about same-day voter registration? County level, state, those are very important elected official positions that we need to be asking them, what are your views on access to democracy, particularly those for the populations that have been historically underrepresented. So we have a lot of work to do, but I'm just gonna finish with this last comment. Despite all the roadblocks that we're seeing, we still hear every single day from young voters, from voters who haven't voted 4 8 years saying, yeah, man, I drove out 20 miles and I got my form. I found a friend that had a printer and I printed out my form. I'm hoping my mother, it's her first time voting. She just became a citizen. So our community is going above and beyond despite all these roadblocks. And I think we're going to see this collective movement continue and to build a stronger democracy here in Texas.
Wow. Okay. We do have a couple of audience questions, but I also I know that you probably want to respond to what each other said. I don't know, Margaret, if there was anything you wanted to say before we launch into questions. Oh, and I'm sorry, you're muted. I know.
I just found it so powerful, Angelica, for you to really frame the challenges and the barriers through your own experience, because you were already a motivated voter. You were already someone who knew how to just navigate bureaucracies, right? Because that's part of what you learn in college. And, just like, okay, if I don't get an answer here, I can go someplace else. For a lot of people, no pueden, right? I mean, they just get discouraged, and it's like, it shouldn't be this hard. It is made this hard for a reason. They don't want us to vote. We need to get it, right? These mechanisms, these are put together like this with so many different steps and so many different places and so many ways that you can just like walk away. It's because they want you to walk away. That's why we just need to, just like con ganas, right? I'm going to do everything that it takes, because there are systems where people are automatically registered to vote. There are systems where there is no difficulty in voting. For us, it's difficult because they want to suppress the vote.
Al, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, I couldn't say any better. That's all true. There isn't this madness, some method. So I've been watching my own state for 40, 50 years, and there's no doubt every time we remove one barrier, another one comes up. So I hear you.
Yeah. So speaking of barriers, one of the audience questions is about poll taxes. I'm wondering if anybody might offer an explanation of what poll taxes were and when those were in effect.
Well, those were in effect through about the mid 1960s, and they just required you to pay something to have the right to vote. It wasn't too, theoretically, it wasn't too much. It was $1, $1.50, but that was back in the 60s when that could mean a lot, and it just put an extra barrier in the way. And they did find that it slowed down a lot of voting among poor people, and especially Latinos and African Americans. Finally, the Supreme Court said you couldn't do it. It's a violation of the law, but it still had a long-term effect. Now, some people compared the voter ID thing to a poll tax, because in order to get your voter ID, you had to get your citizenship papers and other papers, and that cost money. So some people had to pay $20 or $30 or $40 just to get the paperwork in order to get their voter ID in order to be able to vote. So they looked at that as a poll tax. But it's just one of the many barriers that have been there through the years.
Yeah, and Sarah, again, this is something that we think, oh, this is history, right? This has been done away with, but the remnants of it are still in our voter registration system. For a lot of counties in the state of Texas, the voter registration is operated by the tax assessor's office, the tax assessors and voter registration office. So some counties are moving towards, we have an election administrator that oversees voter registration and elections. Harris County is undergoing a transition from voter registration existing under the tax assessor's office and then elections existing under the county clerk. So in Spanish, a lot of the times when people would ask me, where do I go and pick up a voter registration form? I say, donde pagas las taxas? Where you go and pay your taxes. And it's just like, oh, okay, I guess, sure. And so that, again, we think it's history, but it continues to live in our system. And then I would say, I totally agree with you, Al. I mean, the voter ID is so ridiculous. I worked with a lot of young students who thought that their college ID was enough for them to go vote. In urban areas and also in rural areas, and particularly in our community, some folks don't get a driver's license as soon as they turn 16 or 18, right? And so they're not going to go out of their way to pay for an ID that costs $25, $30, $35, go wait in line at the DMV, if the only reason they're going to use it is to go vote. And so often they show up with their state university ID and get turned away. So it is, I mean, I think that's a voter ID is just another really big issue that Texas has to take on.
I did want to ask about, in particular, the situation with the pandemic. I know Margaret pointed to some of this, but when we do have a large Mexican-American population involved in the service industry, where already people are exposing themselves maybe more than they need to, and then now, asking people, take another risk, go and vote, and of course we want them to vote, but how do we have this conversation about being safe and voting?
Yeah, I mean, mi familia vota, we just truly believe elections should be safe, secure, and accessible. So we're always on the lookout for, if you're changing elections to make them safe, make sure they're safe and accessible to everyone. Because we already know that our community has trouble accessing democracy. It's possible. I think people think that it's a big, it's a big challenge, but we've already seen how other states are doing it. We've already seen counties in the state of Texas really implement creative initiatives, and people deserve to choose how they want to vote and have options and decide what is best for them. I think that is something that's so beautiful. That's so beautiful about democracy, right? You don't have to put yourself at risk. And we know that for our community, what we've heard on the ground is people want to vote by mail. They can't, but they're trying to get their mother to vote by mail, right? Because they don't want her at risk. So now you have these in the same household, you have staggered voting options, right? And I think people are adjusting to it, but wouldn't it just be easier if the entire family voted by mail because they were able to and didn't have to worry about being prosecuted? And so people do want that accessibility, but we do think it's possible. But in order to do that, our state and our counties have to put money behind it. And we have to recognize that investment is so crucial. And you cannot partially invest and be content with it because you know the traditional voters are going to come out. It's enough for traditional voters to come out. We have to it's so necessary to make robust investment to ensure that everyone in your county, everyone in your state is voting, whether it's vote by mail, investing in that, whether it's drive-through voting, whether it's sanitation and safety and in-person voting, renting out new spaces, hiring more people. And so there's so many different creative ways you can do it, but it does require investment.
But I think that the other thing is that we are not in the same position that we were in March or April. The scientists and certainly the health providers have learned a lot about the disease, about this particular coronavirus. And so what we know is that it really matters for people to wear a mask and to wear a mask correctly. That means that you have to wear it over your nose and mouth. And we now know that the best masks are if they have a couple layers. A bandana isn't as good. I think a lot of people now know, how to wear those masks, that it's important to socially distance, that it is important to wash your hands when you've been out in the community. These things matter. And if they are observed, we can vote and we can be reasonably safe. It is a very, very contagious virus. We know that. And that it is particularly contagious for people who have other kinds of conditions. Diabetes certainly is a big one in our community, but heart disease and other things that lower the immunity. But I think that if people have a plan, right, that they can decide, are there times and are there places that you can choose where in fact your exposure to the virus will be less, right? But I think that's one of the advantages that we have for having had this period of time when the scientists are just learning more and more and really having to correct themselves for the information that they gave earlier, which is really what happened with Dr. Fauci, right? Who originally said that he didn't think masks were an important safety, device. And then he was wrong. Science proved him wrong. And so he came back and he said that. But a lot of people say, well, no, he originally said this. Well, no, we've learned that in fact, masks can be they can be lifesavers.
That relates to the voting thing in several ways. There have actually been two cases here. In one, I think there were some counties that wanted to extend absentee voting to anyone who had a concern about COVID, and the state fought it, saying that only people over 65 have the right to get an absentee ballot, or if you have a condition, but you could not just allege, well, I'm worried about COVID, that was not enough. So the Supreme Court even had trouble with this one, but they finally sort of supported the state, said, okay, just saying you're afraid of COVID is not enough. You have to show you have a real condition. So that's one thing that would have been done. Also, in a recent lawsuit, a group of retired persons filed a lawsuit. So far, they're winning on the lever, on straight line voting. And the argument they made is that it takes so long to do a ballot if you have 60 or 70 elections to look at one by one, and then it's quicker to vote straight line. Now, there are a lot of issues around that. I know there are a lot of partisan issues, but the basic argument makes sense. I know Angelica's in Harris County, their ballot's probably going to have, I don't know, 80 or 90 elections on it because they elect all their judges every 4 years, county court, all the local officials, and to go through each one is going to be very difficult. So Judge Marmolejo from Laredo said that violated these persons' rights, could endanger them, and it violated the Voting Rights Act. We'll have to see where that goes on appeal. But so these things are all tied into the legal barriers we're talking about.
Just to add on that, people taking a really long time to fill out their ballot means lines are growing longer outside, and we want to maintain social distancing. Another thing counties need to take into consideration. That's
right. I guess that's the argument.
So that's another reason to have a plan, because you can get a sample ballot, you can sit at home, you can decide, who you're going to vote for, so that when you arrive there, you just like fill in the little cositas, right? The little circles there. But it still takes time, right? But it takes less time if you've actually, there are some people who vote for only some of the candidates, right? Or some of the issues. But if you're going to vote for the whole thing, it's going to take some time.
Okay, I do want to just tell Bexar County residents, if you're looking for your sample ballot, you can go to bear.org, and then you click on the elections department and you can download a sample ballot there. We do have one more question, and this is I know it's a hard one, but in the last few minutes, maybe you can each take a stab at it. How can we make a difference?
Elect the right people.
Get everybody to go vote.
And get everybody to go vote. I mean, I think if our community votes really at a high level, I think there'll be a real change in who gets elected. And that eventually will affect it's still going to take a long time. And by the way, no matter which party you are, even if they're all Democrats, there's still issues. Mm-hmm. So in fact, those of us who are older remember when our opponents in these battles were all Democrats back in the 60s. So, but basically at this time, I think it's clearer on who has the right positions on these issues, and go out there and vote the bad ones out and the good ones in.
I think that one of the ways that we can make a difference is by making this an opportunity to talk about why democracy matters to our families, right? What difference does it make, right? Because we usually don't do that, right? We usually don't really talk about, well, what difference does it make if the president is a Republican or a Democrat? What do the two parties believe? And a lot of the people in our families may not know. They may not have that information. And yet, who is elected is going to affect every parts of our life. That is always true. But this time, this election is really going to decide whether we are able to keep a democracy or whether we become an authoritarian country and really a fascist country where there is much more violence, where the government really responds to the interests of only a few people, mostly people with money, and the interests of working people are really they're not able to affect the choices that government makes. We need to think about what our life would be like if we didn't have an opportunity to make some choices, to be heard. And I think that part of this is just telling some stories. I think that Angelica's story is emblematic of that. To actually think back, when was the first time you voted? How did you vote? How did you decide to go vote? All of these are stories that can make such a lasting impression on the people in your family. Not only the people in your family, your friends. This is an election where it has to be a collective. Everyone you know, twist their arms, pay them, kick them. I don't care what you do. You have to get people out there. You've got to get them motivated. You've got to say, even if it's hard, I'm going to get there. I'm going to vote. Make it, I'm just kidding about paying and kicking. I mean, I'm just exaggerating it. But I do think, use all of your persuasion to get your friends and family there.
Yeah, I 100% agree with those two. And if I can add two maybe unique perspectives, I think one, continue to advocate for civic education beyond November 3rd. Let's ensure that civic education is part of our school system. It's part of how we talk. On an individual level, I'll just say, like, I love what I do. I do it, and I wake up every day, and there's not a day that goes by that I'm just like, man, I wish I didn't have to go to work. But this work is hard because sometimes we carry the burden on our shoulders. What's really helpful and instrumental in our work is when we have educators and health professionals and community service providers saying, I have a network of families. How do we get them involved civically? How do I use my platform, my profession, to stop worrying that I'm talking about politics and start talking about community empowerment and how civic engagement intersects with that? That has been crucial to our work. And so when people say, what can I do? It's who are you serving and how can we get civic engagement resources from Mi Familia Vota to you, and then start expanding from there. So yes, take a look at your own platform and how you can continue to be an advocate in a nonpartisan way, correct? But you have a lot of power and you have a lot of opportunity to impact change through that lens.
So
Okay,
thank you, Angelica. Your work has been just so inspiring. Thank you.
No, I'm so honored to be here with y'all.
Before we head out, as we approach the end of the hour, is it too late to fill out your census?
No,
No, there are a few more days. It's been extended.
Okay.
Fill out the census. It's dollars. It is literally dollars for our community.
We don't want New Mexico to steal our Texas dollars.
I want every dollar.
No,
Okay.
it's just so important and
Important.
Yeah, it's not only, it's redistricting, that's, voting lawyers
Okay.
think, but it's money for schools, it's money for roads, it's money for highways, it's money for civic programs, education programs, all of it's related to your numbers. So,
and visibility
has to get out there.
Okay, so you still have a little bit of time to fill out the census, but don't delay. And you have until when to register to vote in Texas? Monday,
October 5th. Your form has to be postmarked.
Okay, you know what to do. Thank you so much to our panelists. This was a wonderful conversation. Thank you for everybody who joined us tonight. This video will continue to be available online for viewing. And we have more programs coming up. Visit our Facebook page to learn about those things. And we hope to see you soon. Have a wonderful night.
Thank you.
I enjoyed it.
Thank you so much.